History of the Bible, the book and its faiths, written by John Barton. Now, John Barton, who I've had the privilege of interviewing on Blogging Theology, is a professor of the Bible at Oxford University, no less. And he's a clergyman, so he's a Church of England priest, so he's a believing Christian, and he's an expert on the Bible. And this particular book, is hugely esteemed and critically praised for its incredible knowledge and erudition. It's very lucid, very readable. And if you want a good education about the history of the Bible, its texts, its canonization, and so on, this is one of the best books on the market. And I do recommend it. So what does this expert say about the New Testament? And I think this is really important. This comes as a shock. Will come as a shock to Christians. I would say 99% of the Christians have no idea about this. See what you think about what he says. Just think about it and see if it makes sense. So in chapter 10, excuse me, page 239, the Reverend Professor John Martin writes the following: "The New Testament did not begin life as a collection of sacred writings at all, but as occasional literature, highly important, but not sacrosanct. Each of Paul's letters is addressed to a specific situation in one of the local churches. And though he no doubt intended his letters to be kept and reread, they were not holy in the way that the Hebrew scriptures unequivocally were. The Gospels, treated so solemnly in later Christian life and liturgy, are the distillation of traditions about Jesus, and as such were also naturally highly regarded and copied for subsequent generations. But they were not seen by the first Christians as verbally exact. There was no tradition, as there was in Judaism, of precise copying of the text, with the consequence that New Testament manuscripts vary greatly and none is authoritative." And then he continues, "There is clear evidence for the first few generations the Gospels did not operate as sacred scripture. They did not operate as sacred scripture, but were seen as collections of material about Jesus, which could be drawn on in retelling his story. Just as Matthew retold Mark with additions and omissions," because the standard view now is that Matthew copied Mark, changed him, embellished him, corrected him, because he disagreed with Mark on important matters to do with the Jewish law, for example, and other matters. So clearly Matthew didn't regard Mark as scripture. Otherwise, why would he change him? He wouldn't want to do that, would he? Obviously. Just as Matthew would retold Mark with additions and omissions, so an early Christian preacher could in some measure extemporize from the gospel he or she knew best, or perhaps already from a mental harmony of more than one gospel. So the point here is there's clear evidence that for the first few generations, the Gospels did not operate as scripture. They were not quoted as scripture. Now, he goes on to explain in a lot more detail how this is the case. He looks at the works of Justin Martyr, for example, in the 2nd century, and he looks at the early fathers in the 2nd century. And when they quoted the words of Jesus, they were not quoting them as part of a canon of scripture, but the words themselves were authoritative. Like the red letter Bibles we have today in some editions, it's like, the words in red, they're inspired, they're from God, they're from the prophet Jesus.